In this nugget, you and I have been called in to assist in getting a fault tolerance virtual machine, VM-1, up and running. Currently, it's not booting, or that's what the customer claims, and this lab will verify the results, and then we'll take a look at why it's happening, and then we'll resolve the issue. And as always, you're welcome to, with the scenario, work on the hands-on lab first. So if you'd like to do that, pause the video right here, work on the lab, and we'll compare notes on how we solved it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the lab walkthrough of both the problem and the solution. So let's begin our troubleshooting. We're logged on to the vSphere web client, logged on as administrator at vsphere.local. We have VM1 selected in the navigator pane, and the icon for VM1 is slightly darker blue, and that represents that it's configured for fault tolerance for that VM. So let's start off by trying to start that VM. So with it selected, we could right click and then from the menu select the power on option, or with it selected here, we could use the icon right here to power on that virtual machine. So let's go ahead and do that right now. And we have some messages that popped up. It says that VM1, that the amount of CPU resources available in the parent resource pool is insufficient for the operation, and the secondary VM is also having the same problem. The amount of CPU resources available in the parent resource pool is insufficient for the operation. So one thing to be aware of regarding virtual machines that have fault tolerance enabled on them is that they are going to, by default, have a memory reservation for all of their memory. So if a VM had been configured in hardware with 1 GB of memory with fault tolerance, that would automatically be set up as a guaranteed reservation. And it's kind of a double hit because the VM itself will get the 1 GB reservation for the memory it has, and also the secondary on the other ESXi host that it's running on will also have that memory reserved for it. So, but this message here is indicating the CPU resources aren't available. So if we take a closer look at that and click on OK for the message, here with VM1 selected and on the summary tab for that VM, this VM is in cluster 1, so it's not part of a resource pool or something else. And for its CPU reservation, we could look at that a couple of different ways. We could expand under VM hardware, the CPU section here, and that's showing us under CPU that we have a reservation for 9 GHz. We could also expand the memory section here and scroll down just a little bit. And here it's showing us the reservation based on the amount of memory that that VM has configured. So we can't reduce or change the actual memory reservation because it's on by default for the fault-tolerant machine, but we can mess with the reservations for CPU. So to configure the settings for VM1, we can right-click here, and the quickest way to get there is just to select Edit Resource Settings from the menu for VM-1. The memory reservations for this VM are reserving all of its physical RAM, so we can't mess with the memory, but if we go up to CPU, we could change this. So currently it's reserving 9,000 megahertz, 9 gigahertz. So we could reduce this number. Let's go ahead and guarantee it 1. And let's, from the drop down over here, select gigahertz. And didn't take my 1. So we'll put a 1 there, and then with gigahertz selected, it should be okay with a reservation of 1 gigahertz. And if it turns out that if we have two hosts, for example, host A and host B, and the primary is running on host A, and the secondary for the fault tolerance is running on host B, if host B is oversubscribed and doesn't have enough CPU to go around, we have a couple solutions. Number one, we could modify the limit, for example, on the primary, and that would also apply to the secondary. So we could say the limit is, for example, 1.5 gigahertz or 2 gigahertz. And whatever we specify on the primary automatically is going to be configured for the secondary, and that would reduce the amount of CPU that the secondary could consume on this host B. Another option is that if host B is really busy and we have yet another host, we could go ahead and do a vMotion to move the secondary from host B over to host C, which is less busy. So with those ideas in mind, let's limit this CPU for this VM. Let's go ahead and limit it to 2, and from the drop down we'll select gigahertz. So that way, when this VM boots up with its secondary copy as well, they'll both have at least 1 gigahertz each, and they'll also be limited to the maximum of 2 gigahertz each on their respective hosts. So we'll go ahead and click on OK. And with those changes in place, let's right click, and from the menu hover over Power and click on Power On regarding VM-1. And that looks better. So we have a little warning saying that our VM fault tolerant state has changed. That's true. It's changing from being off to powering on. So we'll go ahead and we'll click on Reset to Green regarding that message. And then if we click on the recent tasks, it shows us that the initial power on happened, and then it's also now starting up the secondary VM as well. So we'll let that go ahead and complete. And while that's cooking, let me go ahead and minimize recent tasks. Let's go ahead and select the cluster, cluster-1, on the left-hand side in the navigator pane. So here we have an HA failover message. That's because we triggered the powering on of the fault-tolerant VM. So we'll go ahead and reset that to green as well. And it's still complaining that the cluster doesn't have enough resources to meet the HA requirements. Over on the left, if you'll notice, ESXi3 I've placed in maintenance mode so that when our lab booted up, ESXi3 is not available to run VMs. So with the cluster selected, if we click on the VMs tab right here, here it's showing us that the VM1 primary is running as well as the VM-1 secondary. The primary is running on ESXi2, the secondary is running on ESXi1, and that's kind of a challenge because ESXi1 is indeed very, very busy because it's hosting our virtual appliance where vCenter is running, which consumes a boatload of resources. So if we were to click, for example, just on ESXi1 over here on the left in the navigator pane, with the summary tab selected, we can see right here that as far as memory goes, it's consuming a whole bunch of memory, almost all of it. And at the moment, there's a little CPU in use as well between the two VMs that are running there. We could also here click on the VMs tab regarding ESXi1, which will show us the VMs that are associated at the moment with ESXi1. So we have the vCenter server right here, and then down below we have the secondary VM-1 as part of fault tolerance for that VM. So let's open up a console to VM-1, the primary. One way of doing that is to right-click over in the navigator panel for VM-1, and from the menu for VM-1, simply select Open Console. So here we are at VM1. I still have my browser in full screen mode. If we want to take it out, we can simply go ahead and hit F11, take our browser out of full screen mode. Then we have separate tabs for the vSphere web client and a separate tab for VM-1. And if we want to generate some activity, we can go ahead and click on this little mouse icon in the upper left-hand corner of the VM's desktop. And from here, we can click on the terminal emulator. And from here, let's type in GLX gears and run that. And if we let this run for a while, it's going to use some CPU resources both on ESXi2 that has the primary and ESXi1 that's hosting the secondary VM. So if we decide ESXi1 is just too busy and we want to offload that responsibility of providing the CPU resources for the secondary VM, here's what we could do. We'll go back to the vSphere web client. Let's click on the cluster once more on the left-hand side. I just want to verify where those VMs are to begin with. So the primary is running on ESXi2, the secondary is running on ESXi1. So what we could do is we could vMotion or migrate the secondary VM over to another host. Now at the moment we don't have a third host because ESXi3 is in maintenance mode. So we can fix that by right-clicking on ESXi3. And from the Actions menu for ESXi-3, if we hover over Maintenance Mode right here, and then simply from the submenu select Exit Maintenance Mode, that'll take that host ESXi3 out of maintenance mode so it can then be used to host VMs once again. So we'll give that a moment to go ahead and come up. We'll also go ahead and click on the refresh for the vSphere web client right here. And so it looks like ESXi3 is back to the party. So for our purposes right now, we want to move the secondary VM off of ESXi1 and over to ESXi3. So to do that, what we could do is once again click on VMs, just so we can once again make sure we know which host we're dealing with. And what we'll do is we'll right-click on the row for VM-1 secondary. From the Actions menu for this secondary VM, we'll go ahead and click on Migrate from the Actions menu. And you'll notice right here in the Migrate wizard, it's indicating that anything regarding storage is not going to work. And that's because storage vMotion is not available for VMs that use fault tolerance. So anything regarding storage is not going to be an option here regarding migration. But what we can do is we can move the compute resource for this secondary VM. So with that radio button selected, we'll go ahead and click on Next. It's asking us, where do you want to move this secondary VM? We'll go ahead and select ESXi3, click on Next, and then choose the radio button to schedule the vMotion, and click on Next. Here's a summary of what's about to happen. We'll click on Finish, and that'll do the migration of this secondary VM from ESXi1 over to ESXi3. And with the refresh, there it's reflected. So in this nugget, we reduced the CPU reservations on the primary VM so that it and its secondary VM could be booted inside the vSphere environment. And then secondly, we did a migration of the secondary VM from ESXi1, which is a more busy host, over to ESXi3, a less busy host. So I invite you to practice in the hands-on lab working with fault tolerance, which will help reinforce the concepts regarding it and help build your skills in working with vCenter as a whole. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.